I could hear their every word as I stood motionless in the dark corner of the room, hidden behind the heavy burgundy velvet curtains. The whole family was gathered in the living room of my own home, discussing with barely contained excitement what they would do after my death. A death they believed would occur soon, very soon. She won't last more than a few weeks. The doctor was very clear about that. My eldest son, Christopher, would say with a coldness that froze my already fragile heart, "We need to be prepared to act quickly as soon as it happens." No sentimentality. Never in my 68 years of life did I imagine I would reach this point hidden in my own home, pretending to be in my bedroom resting while listening to my family meticulously plan what they would do with my money, my house, my jewelry, my memories. Memories that to them were worth nothing more than the price they could fetch at an antique dealer or auction. The house is worth at least $980,000 on the current market, calculated my son-in-law Thomas, a real estate agent always on the lookout for opportunities. If we sell quickly before the market drops again, we can split a good amount. Caroline, my youngest daughter, and Thomas's wife seemed more interested in my jewelry. That pearl necklace Mom wears only on special occasions was Grandma's. It must be worth a fortune. It's vintage from the 1940s. Melissa, Christopher's wife, was already making a mental list of antique furniture she could bring to her newly opened antique shop. That Victorian dresser in the guest room. I can easily get $12,000 for it. No one, absolutely no one, talked about mementos, photographs, or objects of sentimental value. It was all about monetary value, about how much they could extract from my existence, which for them was already practically over. That's when I felt a single hot tear trickle down the corner of my eye. It wasn't a tear of sadness or self-pity. It was pure distilled anger, fermented by years of small disappointments I deliberately ignored. Years of pretending not to notice the impatient looks when I took too long to write a check, the exasperated sighs when I mentioned that perhaps I should think twice before making a substantial bank transfer, the forced smiles that disappeared the moment I turned my back. Years of being gradually transformed from mother and grandmother into a walking ATM, an obstacle between them and my bank account. And in that moment, hidden behind the curtains, like an intruder in my own life, I made a decision that would change everything. I wouldn't die according to the script they'd written. I wouldn't be the sickly, naive old lady they expected. From that day on, I would write my own ending, and it would be one they would never forget. My name is Elizabeth Taylor, and this is the story of how I faked my own death to teach my family the most important lesson of their lives. Maybe you're listening to this story because you've been through something similar, or maybe you're just looking for a moment of reflection and entertainment. Either way, you're in the right place. This channel was created for people like us who know that real life sometimes surpasses any fiction. Here I share true stories with all the complexity and emotion that only life can offer. Subscribe and become part of this family that understands, supports, and has fun together. Now join me as I tell you how it all began. I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Milwaukee, the daughter of a mechanic and a seamstress who worked long hours to ensure I could get an education. I was the first in my family to go to college, where I earned a nursing degree. It was there that I met Richard, my late husband, then a young medical student with big dreams and empty pockets. We fell madly in love, as only happens in our 20s, and married in 1976 in a simple ceremony in my parents' backyard. We started from scratch with considerable student debt and a small rented apartment in the Boston suburbs. Richard secured a residency at a public hospital, and I worked double shifts in the same hospital's emergency room. They were difficult years, but we were building something together brick by brick. Christopher was born in 1980 and Caroline in 1984, with 2 young children and demanding careers. Every penny was counted 3 times before being spent. There was no room for extravagance. Christmas presents were modest vacations, were camping trips to state parks, clothes were often handmade, downs or gifts from wealthier relatives. But never, not for a second, did our children doubt that they were loved. Richard and I made a point of being present at every school play, every baseball game, every meaningful moment, even if it meant hours of lost sleep or switching shifts with classmates. It was a simple, honest, and looking back, extraordinarily happy life. The big change came in 1995 when Richard was invited to become a partner in a private practice in Newton, an affluent suburb of Boston. Suddenly, our income tripled. We moved to a spacious house with a garden and a pool. The children were transferred to private schools. European vacations became a reality. We could easily have succumbed to the temptation to spend recklessly, as so many of our new neighbors did, but years of forced thrift had taught us the value of money. We continued to live comfortably, but below our means, investing and saving for the future. We wanted to ensure our children had a safety net, that they wouldn't have to face the same hardships we faced. Christopher and Carolyn grew up in a comfortable environment, but we always made a point of instilling in them the value of hard work and financial responsibility. Christopher followed in his father's footsteps and became a doctor specializing in cardiology. Carolyn chose architecture, a profession that combined her artistic talent with a practical sense. They both married young, perhaps too soon. Christopher met Melissa during medical school, an art history student with big ambitions and expensive tastes. Caroline met Thomas at a networking event, a charming and persuasive real estate agent accustomed to dealing with luxury properties and demanding clients. The first signs that something wasn't right appeared after the birth of my grandchildren. Christopher's twins, Kevin and Kyle, came into the world in 2010, two identical boys with Richard's blue eyes. Little Charlotte, Caroline's daughter, was born in 2016, a sweet girl with golden curls and a calm disposition. As a grandmother, I was in heaven. I traveled frequently to Boston. We had moved to a smaller house on Cape Cod after Richard's retirement to help with the children. I bought gifts, clothes, toys. I offered to babysit so the parents could have some alone time. In short, I did what any grandmother would do. I loved unconditionally. It was after Charlotte's birth that Richard began to show the first symptoms: small memory lapses, occasional confusion, an unexplained fall. The tests confirmed our worst fear: early onset Alzheimer's, a sentence without appeal. Over the next 5 years, I would watch helplessly as the brilliant, funny, and kind man I'd shared for decades of my life with gradually faded, replaced by a confused stranger who, on his worst days, didn't even recognize my face. The disease consumed not only Richard, but also much of our savings. The experimental treatments, the full-time caregivers, the home improvements, all of it came at an all astronomical cost that insurance only partially covered. Richard passed away in December 2021, a week before Christmas, on a cold gray afternoon that seemed fitting for the occasion. The funeral was held 3 days later, attended by hundreds of people. Former patients, medical colleagues, and longtime friends all came to pay their respects. Christopher and Carolyn were by my side, offering the support I desperately needed. In the weeks that followed, they took turns, staying with me on Cape Cod, ensuring I wasn't alone. During that first Christmas without Richard, the first New Year, and the first wedding anniversary I would spend alone, I felt truly supported and grateful to have such caring children. It was in March 2022 that I decided to sell the house on Cape Cod. It was too big for me alone, too full of memories. Plus, the distance from Boston meant seeing my grandchildren less, something that had become even more important after Richard's death. Christopher suggested I buy an apartment in Cambridge, close enough for frequent visits, but with enough space to maintain my independence. Caroline disagreed, believing I should buy a house in her neighborhood, Brookline. The discussion dragged on for weeks with heated arguments on both sides. What struck me in retrospect was how the conversation always inevitably turned to financial matters. How much I'd received for the house on Cape Cod. How much an apartment in Cambridge would cost versus a house in Brookline. What would happen to the rest of the money? It was as if suddenly my financial situation was the most important aspect of my existence. At the time, I interpreted it as genuine concern for my well-being. How naive I was. I ended up choosing a small house in Newton, a compromise between my children's suggestions. It was a 1940s bungalow with 3 bedrooms, a modest garden, and plenty of natural light. I paid cash using part of the money from the sale of the Cape Cod house and Richard's life insurance. The remainder, a considerable sum, was invested conservatively under the guidance of my longtime financial advisor, Albert Goldman, a meticulous and discreet man who had managed our finances for over 2 decades. The first few months in Newton were peaceful and in some ways healing. I established a new routine: morning walks around the neighborhood, painting classes on Tuesdays, volunteering at the local hospital on Thursdays, Sunday dinners with the whole family alternating between my home and my children's homes. I was slowly rebuilding my life, finding a new purpose, adapting to the reality of being an independent widow at 66. The first sign of a storm came in August 2022. Christopher showed up unexpectedly on a Wednesday night, visibly tense. After a few pleasantries, he revealed the reason for his visit. Melissa wanted to open an antique store, a dream she'd cherished since college. They'd found the perfect space on Beacon Hill, but they needed $150,000 for the down payment and initial renovations. Banks had rejected the loan due to the high risk of the venture and Melissa's lack of experience in the business. Christopher asked with studied casualness if I could help them with that amount. I was instantly speechless. We'd never discussed such substantial amounts before. Sure, I'd helped financially over the years: down payment contributions, money for renovations, generous gifts for birthdays and graduations. But $1,500. It was a sum that, even in my comfortable situation, would require liquidating some investments. I asked for time to consult with Albert and think it over. Christopher's reaction was revealing. Instead of understanding, I saw barely concealed irritation cross his face. "I thought you wanted us to be happy and fulfilled, Mom," he said, using a tone I recognized from my teenage years when I couldn't get what I wanted. "Melissa's really counting on it. We've already given her the signal to hold her ground. If we miss this opportunity—" He let the sentence hang in the air like a veiled threat. I felt a pang of guilt, that familiar feeling of failing as a mother by not meeting her children's expectations. I promised I'd give her a definitive answer within a few days. I consulted Albert the next morning. His expression said it all before he even spoke. "Elizabeth, you're not a bank," he said with the directness I so valued. "If you want to help your son, consider a smaller amount, maybe $50,000 as an investment with clear repayment terms. But $150,000 without a solid business plan, without prior experience, it's practically throwing money out the window." I knew he was right, but I also felt the weight of Christopher's expectations and, by extension, Melissa's. After 2 days of anguished reflection, I called Christopher in for a talk. I offered $50,000 as an initial investment on the condition that they raise the remainder themselves and present a detailed business plan. I also stipulated that it would be a loan, not a grant, with a flexible but defined repayment schedule. His disappointment was palpable. There were arguments, attempts at emotional manipulation, even a veiled accusation that I was punishing Melissa for some imaginary grudge. In the end, he accepted the terms with visible rejection. A week later, it was Caroline's turn to show up at my door. Her excuse was a casual lunch, just mother and daughter. After an hour of superficial conversation, she revealed the real reason for her visit. Thomas had invested heavily in a real estate venture that had failed spectacularly. They were struggling to pay the mortgage on their house and Charlotte's private school tuition. They needed $80,000 to reorganize their finances and avoid a forced sale of the house. The story sounded eerily similar to Christopher's, only with different numbers and details. This time, I was prepared. I inquired about the exact nature of the financial problems, requested supporting documents, and questioned why they hadn't mentioned the difficulties before they became critical. Caroline was visibly uncomfortable with the interrogation. "I thought you trusted me, Mom," she said, resorting to the same emotional tactic Christopher had used. "After everything we've been through with Dad, I thought we could count on you." The mention of Richard used as emotional leverage was what stung the most. Still, I stood my ground. I offered $40,000, half of what was requested, as a loan with defined terms, not a donation. Caroline left my house that afternoon without giving a definitive answer. 2 days later, she sent a short message accepting the terms. The money was transferred that same week. Neither she nor Thomas mentioned the matter again at subsequent Sunday dinners, as if the episode had never happened. September brought the first birthday I would spend without Richard. The children hosted a dinner at Christopher's house, ostensibly to distract me from the painful occasion. It was a pleasant evening with good food and the grandchildren's joyful presence. But I noticed something strange. Both Christopher and Caroline seemed to be exhibiting signs of sudden prosperity. Christopher was wearing a watch I'd never seen before, a model I recognized as extremely expensive. Caroline was wearing a diamond necklace that was certainly not part of her usual collection. Christopher's house, which I visited regularly, had new furniture in the living room. When I casually mentioned the changes, both offered vague explanations. The watch was a gift from a grateful patient. The necklace, a bargain found at a luxury thrift store. The furniture, a bargain not to be missed. I accepted the explanations at the time, but a seed of doubt had been planted. I began to observe more closely. In the following weeks, I noticed other signs. Melissa driving a new car, Thomas casually mentioning plans for a trip to Europe, the twins suddenly sporting state-off sports equipment. Charlotte signing up for ballet classes at an exclusive gym. All this while, supposedly both couples were facing financial difficulties serious enough to justify borrowing tens of teens of teener, and like the long tens of teeners from their recently widowed mother. In October, I decided to visit the alleged location of Melissa's antique store in Beacon Hill. To my surprise and dismay, the address housed a children's clothing boutique that, according to the owner, had been there for over 2 years. There was no sign of recent renovations or a change of tenant. Christopher's story was a complete fabrication. On the way home, I impulsively drove to Charlotte's school in Brookline. I spoke with the secretary, a friendly lady who readily confirmed that Charlotte's tuition was up to date with no history of late payments or special payment arrangements. Another point in Caroline's story that didn't hold water. I returned home that day with a sinking feeling in my stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. My own children, the people I had raised with love and strong values, were deliberately manipulating me, using elaborate lies to extract money, taking advantage of my emotional vulnerability after the loss of Richard, exploiting my unconditional love for them. The pain of this realization was almost physical, as if someone had punched me directly in the heart. For a few days, I considered confronting them directly. I imagined scenarios where I'd expose their lies over a family dinner, demand explanations, and threaten to cut off financial ties if they didn't immediately show honesty. But something held me back. An inner voice, perhaps the voice of self-preservation, or perhaps just the voice of curiosity, suggesting I wait, observe more. Understand the full extent of the problem before acting. November arrived with the first snowfall, and a disturbing idea began to form in my mind. What if I could see how my children would truly behave if I were no longer present, not just in terms of financial support, but literally absent from this world? How would they react to my death? Would they mourn the loss of a mother or celebrate unrestricted access to their inheritance? The idea was morbid, disturbing, possibly indicative of my fragile mental state. But once planted, it refused to disappear. I consulted Martha Jenkins, an old friend and colleague from my nursing days, now retired like me. Martha had always been the voice of reason, the one unafraid to speak difficult truths. We talked for hours in her cozy Cambridge apartment, me venting about my children's lies, the feeling of betrayal, the disturbing thought of testing their reaction to my death. I hoped she would dissuade me, bring me to reason, remind me that families are complicated and that I should seek reconciliation, not revenge or mind games. To my surprise, after listening intentionally, Martha leaned forward with a gleam in her eye I hadn't seen since our more rebellious nursing days, when we'd challenge arrogant doctors on behind of patients. "What if you actually did it, Lizzie?" she asked, using my childhood nickname. "Not permanently, of course. Just long enough to see how they'd react, what they'd do, what they'd say when they thought no one else was." Listening, the suggestion should have horrified me. Instead, I felt a kind of relief, as if a possibility I'd considered only in dark fantasy had suddenly gained legitimacy through someone else's approval. It would be complex, ethically questionable, and potentially traumatic for everyone involved. Martha continued, always practical, even in her boldest ideas. But if done correctly, with clear boundaries and a defined plan, it could give you the answers you need. She paused, her blue eyes studying my face, with the same intensity she used to assess critically ill patients. The question is, Lizzie, are you prepared to uncover the truth? Whatever it may be. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I stared out the window at the gently falling snowflakes covering Cambridge with a pure white blanket that hid all the imperfections below. The truth, I finally said, is the only thing left for me to seek. I've lied to myself for too long. Over the next few weeks, a plan began to take shape. Faking one's own death wouldn't be easy, especially convincingly enough to fool two educated and relatively sophisticated adults. We would need professional help, official documentation, a plausible scenario, and above all, absolute discretion. Martha knew people who knew people, one of the advantages of having worked for decades in a large urban hospital. Through her, I was introduced to James Sullivan, a former police officer now working as a private investigator specializing in fraud and family surveillance cases. Sullivan was unfazed by my unusual request. Apparently, she wasn't the first elderly client looking for creative ways to test the loyalty of her heirs. Sullivan brought Harold Morris, an estate lawyer with whom he had collaborated on numerous cases, to the team. Maurice was initially hesitant, concerned about the legal and ethical implications of the plan. But after hearing in detail about my children's behavior and reviewing the documentation I had compiled, proven lies, financial manipulation, and a history of loans never mentioned again, he agreed to help, provided we established clear boundaries and a defined timeline. This isn't about punishment or revenge, I explained to him during our second meeting in his quiet office in downtown Crossing. This is about truth. I need to know who I can trust before making decisions that will affect the rest of my life and eventually the lives of my grandchildren. The plan we developed throughout December was complex, but feasible. Essentially, I would simulate a fatal heart attack while sleeping. Martha, with her medical contacts, would secure the necessary documentation. A fake body, a realistic mannequin modified to resemble me, would be briefly used for initial identification and then quickly shipped for cremation, eliminating the need for a real corpse during the wake. Sullivan would oversee all logistical aspects, including discreet surveillance of my children throughout the process. Maurice would handle the legalities, including a fake will that would be read after the funeral. We set a date, January 15th, 2023. We chose a Sunday when it would be natural for me to be home alone with no outside commitments. There would be enough time after the holidays, but before any other significant family events were on the horizon. The plan was limited to 14 days, enough time to observe the initial reactions, the wake, the reading of the will, and the first steps my children would take with their newfound financial freedom. On the 15th day, I would resurrect, confront my family with what I had witnessed, and make it clear that their behavior would have permanent consequences. The weeks leading up to the death were surreal. I continued my normal routine, attending Sunday dinners, babysitting the grandchildren, occasionally keeping up with my painting classes and volunteer work. But internally, I was preparing for one of the most extreme social experiments ever conceived. I began dropping subtle clues, mentions of minor chest pains that came and went, comments about how winter seemed particularly difficult this year, nostalgic remarks about Richard and how much I missed him. Nothing obvious enough to cause genuine concern, just enough to make a sudden heart attack plausible in retrospect. I also took practical steps. I rented a small apartment in Somerville under a false name provided by Sullivan, where I would stay for the 14 days. I transferred a substantial sum of money to a separate bank account accessible only to me to ensure financial independence should the plan somehow go awry. I wrote letters to each of my grandchildren to be delivered when they were older, explaining my actions and assuring them that my love for them remained unwavering regardless of their parents' behavior. And perhaps most painfully, I prepared myself emotionally for the possibility that what I discovered would be even worse than I had imagined. On the evening of January 14th, I called Christopher and Caroline separately. They were brief, seemingly banal conversations. I asked about their plans for the week, commented on the weather, and mentioned a book I was reading. I gave no indication that these might be our last normal conversations. Christopher seemed distracted, clearly with his mind elsewhere. Caroline was more attentive, but I detected an underlying impatience, as if the obligation to talk to her elderly mother were a nuisance in her busy schedule. They both declined my invitation for coffee the following afternoon, citing prior commitments. Perfect for the plan, devastating to a mother's heart. The morning of January 15th arrived, clear and cold. I followed my normal routine: breakfast, newspaper, a brief walk around the neighborhood. At 1000 a.m., as agreed, Martha arrived, bringing with her a discreet young man who was introduced only as Dr. Palmer. He carried a medical bag and a professional expression that revealed nothing of the unusual situation. Sullivan arrived a few minutes later, followed by two assistants carrying a large, heavy box containing the mannequin that would serve as my temporary body. By 11 a.m., everything was ready. The mannequin, dressed in my favorite pajamas, was positioned on my bed in a posture suggestive of someone who had passed away peacefully in their sleep. Dr. Palmer applied a few finishing touches to ensure sufficient realism for a first look, not something that would stand up to a thorough medical examination, but convincing enough for an initial discovery by a maid or relative. Sullivan verified that all the hidden cameras were working properly in the living room, in my bedroom, and in the office where important documents were kept. Small microphones had been strategically placed to pick up conversations throughout the house. Martha hugged me tightly before I left through the back door. "Are you sure about this, Lizzie?" she asked one last time. "There's still time to stop everything." I hesitated for only a moment, thinking of the years of love and sacrifice. The happy memories, the moments when I genuinely believed I'd raised children who valued me for who I was, not for what I could provide. But then I remembered the lies, the manipulations, the glances exchanged when they thought I wasn't paying attention. "I'm sure," I finally replied. "It's time to face the truth, whatever it may be." I walked out the back of the garden, through a small gate in the fence that was rarely used, straight to Sullivan's car, which was waiting for me on the side street. As we drove away, I took one last look at the house that had been my home for the past few years. It was officially dead. And in a way, a part of me, the naive mother who believed in the unquestionable goodness of her children, had truly died that day. The plan unfolded with almost surgical precision. Maria, my twice-weekly maid, arrived at 1 p.m. as usual. Sullivan, observing remotely through the cameras, reported his reaction via text message. He found the body, panicked, and called 911. Paramedics arrived, pronounced the mannequin dead, and removed the mannequin. During the brief window in which the house was empty, one of Sullivan's assistants entered to exchange the mannequin for an equivalent weight in a body bag, ensuring no one noticed the difference during transport. Maurice was notified and, as agreed, contacted Christopher and Carolyn with the sad news. From my hiding place in Somerville, I received constant updates. Sullivan described my children's initial reactions to the phone: apparent shock, a few tears, practical questions about procedures. Maurice reported that they both asked about the will before even discussing funeral arrangements. Martha, who had officially certified my death as a family friend, noted how Caroline seemed more concerned about who would have access to the house during the period between death and the funeral than with the details of my supposed final condition. The wake was scheduled for January 18th at my own home, a choice made by Christopher and Carolyn, ostensibly to honor my love of home, but conveniently eliminating funeral home costs. Sullivan installed additional cameras and microphones, including in a particularly brilliant move inside the closed casket itself, where the weight that had replaced the mannequin now rested. Martha ensured that the official death certificate listed heart attack as the cause, making the closed casket option perfectly logical, considering my supposed desire to be cremated immediately after the ceremony. The 3 days between my death and the wake were revealing in themselves. Sullivan kept constant watch on the house and reported interesting activity. Christopher and Melissa showed up less than 24 hours after the news, clearly taking inventory of valuables. Carolyn and Thomas arrived soon after, and there was a heated argument over who would get my jewelry and artwork. Neither of them touched the family albums, the letters Richard and I exchanged during our engagement, or the small objects of purely sentimental value that dotted the house. It was as if the essence of my life, the things I treasured most, were completely invisible to them. On January 18th, the day of the wake, I checked into a small hotel a few blocks from my home. Sullivan had set up a secure camera feed, allowing me to watch my own funeral in real time. I dressed in black as was appropriate and mentally prepared myself for what I might see and hear. Part of me still desperately hoped I was wrong, that I would see my children genuinely devastated, sharing loving memories, mourning not just the material loss, but the loss of the mother who had loved them unconditionally for decades. The wake began at 2 p.m. To my surprise, there were more people than I expected, about 30, including neighbors, former co-workers, and some friends I hadn't seen in years. Christopher and Carolyn were impeccably dressed in black, their expressions appropriately solemn. Melissa and Thomas stood respectfully beside their spouses. The grandchildren were present, the twins uncomfortable in suits. They clearly weren't used to wearing little Charlotte, clutching a doll I'd given her for Christmas, genuine tears in her innocent little eyes. There were brief speeches. A former hospital colleague spoke of my dedication to patients. A neighbor mentioned my willingness to help during a particularly severe snowstorm. Martha said a few words about our long friendship and the adventures we shared. Christopher spoke for a few minutes about what a devoted mother and extraordinary grandmother I had been, though his words sounded rehearsed and hollow. Caroline didn't speak, apparently deeply moved, though cameras showed her discreetly checking her phone during the ceremony. Around 4 p.m., Morris announced that there would be a private farewell for the immediate family before the casket was taken away for cremation. The guests gradually filed out, offering final condolences and promises to stay in touch that would likely never be fulfilled. When the door closed behind the last visitor, leaving only Christopher, Melissa, Carolyn, Thomas, the children, and Maurice, the atmosphere in the room instantly changed. It was like watching actors walk off stage and remove their masks backstage, revealing their true faces beneath the stage makeup. Christopher immediately loosened his tie and sighed loudly. "It's finally over," he said, as if the funeral were an annoying obligation, not a farewell to his mother. Melissa began to wander around the room, openly assessing the furniture and decorative objects. "Can we start emptying the house tomorrow?" she asked. Caroline sent the children out into the garden, saying that the adults needed to talk. Thomas pulled a notebook from his inside jacket pocket and began to do calculations, mumbling something about real estate prices in the area. What happened next confirmed all my worst fears. For nearly 2 hours, they openly discussed how they would divide my assets, who would get which valuable items, and how much they expected to receive from the sale of the house. Christopher suggested they should clean out my bank accounts as quickly as possible. Before the government gets involved, Carolyn argued that the most valuable jewelry should go to her, since Mom always said it was for her daughters and granddaughters. Thomas asked Maurice if there was any way to expedite the release of the investments, perhaps avoiding some taxes in the process. Melissa was already making plans for the antiques store, which now with real capital could finally be more than a front for personal spending. At no point was there any mention of longing, of cherished memories, of regrets over conversations that hadn't had time to happen. The closest thing to this was when Caroline casually remarked that I would have liked to see Charlotte wearing my pearls when she was older, not as a way to keep my memory alive, but as justification for claiming the jewels for her lineage. The most revealing moment came when Christopher approached the coffin and, in a gesture that chilled my blood even through the computer screen, tapped the wood twice. "Well, Mom," he said with a suppressed laugh, "you were useful in life, and it looks like you'll continue to be useful in death." Caroline scolded him lightly, not for the comment itself, but for the risk of someone overhearing. "Don't be silly, Chris. The walls have ears," she said, glancing nervously at the window as if a neighbor might be eavesdropping. The irony of her words, considering that every syllable was being picked up by multiple recording devices and observed by the dead herself was almost poetic. As I watched that grotesque scene alone in an anonymous hotel room, I felt something shift permanently within me. It wasn't just pain, though, there was plenty of it. It was a crystal clarity, a definitive awakening. These people were no longer my children in the emotional sense of the word. They were strangers wearing the faces of the children I had loved, raised, and protected. Strangers who, through some terrible failure to transmit values or an inherent greed I had never grasped, saw me only as a means to material ends. The naive mother within me died in that moment as definitively as Elizabeth Taylor had supposedly died 3 days earlier. At 6 p.m., Morris announced that funeral home workers would be coming to collect the casket for cremation. Everyone left the room briefly, giving one of Sullivan's assistants disguised as a funeral home worker the opportunity to quickly swap the weight in the casket with another object of similar mass. The plan was flawless, but I had seen enough. I turned off the broadcast and sat in the darkness of the hotel room for hours, processing everything I had witnessed. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every word, every scornful laugh, every calculating comment. I thought about my grandchildren, especially Charlotte, whose grief seemed genuine. What example were they setting for these innocent children? What values were they instilling in them by the way they treated their grandmother's memory in the silence of that anonymous room? I made decisions that would change the course of our lives forever. The next morning, January 19th, the reading of the false will would take place at my home. Everyone would be present: Christopher and Melissa Carolyn and Thomas Morris as the executor, and Sullivan, now disguised as Morris's legal assistant. I would observe everything remotely as I had the day before, but with a clarity of purpose that had been lacking until then. The reading of the will began promptly at 1000 a.m. Morris, ever the professional, began by explaining the legal procedures and the responsibilities of each heir. Then he proceeded to read the fake document. As planned, the fake will stipulated that my house and 50% of my financial assets would be divided equally between Christopher and Caroline. The other 50% would be placed in a trust for my grandchildren's education with restricted access until they turned 21. My jewelry and personal effects were to be divided amicably among my children, with the exception of a few specific pieces I had supposedly designated for each of my grandchildren. As Morris read each item, Christopher and Caroline's expressions alternated between satisfaction and displeasure, depending on who seemed to be receiving more. Thomas was doing calculations on his phone, probably estimating how much they would receive in total. Melissa was already planning aloud which pieces of furniture they would take to the store and which they would keep for personal use. Neither of them asked about objects of sentimental value, family photographs, mementos of the life Richard and I had built together. It was all about monetary value, about how much they could extract from my now ended existence. After the reading, Morris informed them that there would be a 30-day period for the will to be officially validated, but that they could now begin planning the division of the movable assets. Christopher immediately suggested they start that very day before some distant relative shows up with demands. Caroline agreed, mentioning that she already had a moving company on standby. Thomas discreetly asked Maurice if there was a detailed inventory of the jewelry or if they could simply take whatever they wanted. Melissa had already mentally separated the furniture and decorative objects that would be most profitable for the store. Sullivan, still in his paralegal guise, documented every reaction, every unkind comment, every revelation of character. Maurice maintaining his professional demeanor even in the face of such spectacle of greed simply answered the legal questions with clinical precision. By the time the meeting ended around noon, Christopher and Caroline were already arguing over who would get my grand piano, a gift Richard had given me for our 20th wedding anniversary, and which I played almost every night. Watching all this from my hiding place, I made my final decision. It was time to end the experiment and confront them with the truth. I wouldn't wait the initially planned 14-day aside scene more than enough. I called Maurice and gave him new instructions. We would schedule a meeting at my house for the following day, January 20th, supposedly 2 discuss some unexpected legal matters that had arisen. Christopher and Caroline readily agreed, likely thinking it was an opportunity to expedite the process of dividing my assets. I spent the rest of that day finalizing preparations for the confrontation. With Sullivan's help, I amended my royal will, reallocating much of my fortune to charity with only a fraction reserved for my grandchildren when they came of age. The house would be donated to a foundation that would transform it into a temporary home for elderly nurses without resources. As for the objects that Christopher, Melissa, Carolyn, and Thomas had already begun stealthily removing from the house, Sullivan had meticulously documented everything. They would have to return each item or face criminal charges. Martha helped me prepare emotionally for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult moments of my life. "They'll try to manipulate you again," she warned. "They'll cry, they'll beg, they'll threaten, they'll guilt trip you. Be prepared." I spent hours rehearsing what I would say, how I would maintain my composure, how I wouldn't give in to the temptation to forgive, simply because they were my children, and I had loved them all my life despite everything. On the morning of January 20th, I dressed carefully, a sleek black suit. Richard had given me for our last wedding anniversary pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother and a striking perfume I always wore on special occasions. Martha helped me with my makeup, giving my face a healthy yet understated look. Sullivan picked me up at 9:00 a.m. and together we drove back to Newton in silence. I stopped 2 blocks from my house where Morris was waiting for me in his car. The plan was simple. I would wait in his vehicle until everyone was gathered in the living room. Then, at the right moment, I would enter and confront my family. Sullivan would ensure everything was recorded for later legal protection. At 1:30 a.m., Morris texted me everyone had arrived. Christopher, Melissa, Carolyn, Thomas, and unexpectedly my grandchildren were there too. Maurice hadn't anticipated the children's presence, but I decided we'd go ahead anyway. Maybe it was best for them to know the truth about their parents. I waited another 10 minutes, taking deep breaths, preparing myself mentally and emotionally for what was to come. Then I got out of the car and walked slowly to my own house. I used the key I'd never given to anyone. I opened the door quietly and stood for a moment listening to the voices coming from the living room. They were arguing about my piano, which both Christopher and Carolyn wanted to sell. But they disagreed about who should get the money. I took one last deep breath and entered the room. The silence that followed was absolute, almost supernatural. 7 pairs of eyes fixed on me in varying states of shock and disbelief. Charlotte was the first to react. "Grandma," she cried, rushing toward me and hugging my legs tightly. The twins remained frozen, as if seeing a ghost. The adults had much more complex reactions. Christopher paled instantly, staggering backward until he nearly fell into a chair. Melissa clasped her hands to her mouth, stifling a scream. Caroline began to tremble visibly, clutching Thomas's arm, who looked ready to faint. "Hello, everyone," I said with a calm I didn't know I possessed. "It seems there's been a slight misunderstanding regarding my death." The next few minutes were chaotic. Caroline began to cry hysterically, alternating between joy at seeing me alive and panic at what I might have overheard. Christopher recovered more quickly, trying to construct a narrative that they were just taking care of things as I would have liked. Thomas remained silent, clearly calculating the legal implications of what had happened. Melissa was the only one to show any honesty, collapsing into a chair and muttering, "We're ruined," repeatedly. My grandchildren, after their initial shock, were genuinely happy. Charlotte was glued to my side, and the twins asked 1,000 questions. About how I had been resurrected, Morris remained in the background observing. Everything with a neutral expression, while Sullivan, still disguised as an assistant, discreetly documented every reaction with a small hidden camera. When the initial chaos subsided, I asked everyone to sit down. It was time for explanations. In a firm voice that brooked no interruptions, I told them the whole truth. How I had noticed the changes in their behavior, the loans based on lies, the increasingly rare visits, the barely concealed greed. How I had planned my fake death to test their loyalty and love. How I had witnessed through the cameras and microphones every conversation, every plan to divide my assets, every dismissive comment. As I spoke, the adult faces before me went through a range of emotions: shock, shame, fear, anger, and finally defeated resignation. They knew they had been caught exposed in their greed and deceit. "You failed the test," I concluded simply. "Not just as children, but as human beings." Christopher was the first to try to defend himself. He talked about financial pressure, the costs of raising 2 children, and how Melissa needed the store to feel fulfilled. Caroline followed suit, mentioning the difficulties at Thomas's job, the uncertain future, and the sacrifices they made daily. I listened silently without showing any emotion. When they finished their pathetic excuses, I simply shook my head. "The problem isn't that you needed money. The problem is that you saw me as a bank, not as your mother. Not as a person with feelings, with love to give beyond financial resources." I looked at Morris and nodded. It was time for the next revelation. Morris pulled a set of documents from his briefcase, my true will, signed and authenticated in the presence of witnesses. 3 days before my death, he began reading it aloud. According to my new provisions, 80% of my fortune would be divided among various charities, primarily those dedicated to elderly people abandoned by their families. Only 10% would be placed in a trust for my grandchildren with restricted access until they turn 25 and under, the supervision of independent trustees, not their parents. The remaining 10% would be used for my own subsistence for the remainder of my life. The house would remain my sole property until my true death, when it would be donated to a foundation that would transform it into a shelter for destitute retired nurses. As for the personal effects, jewelry, and furniture that Christopher, Melissa, Carolyn, and Thomas had already begun removing from the house, Sullivan presented a detailed list and informed them that they had 48 hours to return. Everything under penalty of criminal prosecution for theft. The silence in the room was deafening. Charlotte began to cry softly, not fully understanding what was happening, but sensing the tension in the air. Kevin and Kyle looked at their parents with a mixture of confusion and growing disappointment, beginning to understand that something very wrong had been done. Christopher was the first to explode. He stood up abruptly, his face red with rage. "You can't do this. We're your children, for God's sake. All this because of a few thoughtless comments during a stressful moment. Have you completely lost your mind, Mom?" Caroline joined her brother, alternating between emotional pleas and veiled threats to contest the will on the grounds of my mental incapacity. Thomas tried a more calculating approach, suggesting that we could reach an agreement that would satisfy everyone. Melissa was the only one who remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor, apparently understanding the complete irreversibility of the situation. I waited patiently until they calmed down, or at least until they were too breathless to continue. Then, in the same calm voice I had maintained from the beginning, I replied, "These weren't just thoughtless remarks. This was a pattern of behavior that went on for years. You saw me as an ATM, not your mother. You planned the division of my assets while my body was supposedly still warm. You laughed and celebrated my death. These aren't thoughtless remarks. They are revelations of character." I looked directly at my grandchildren, who were watching with wide eyes. "The only thing I regret right now is the example you're setting for these children. What kind of values are you instilling when you treat your own mother and grandmother this way?" The meeting continued for several more hours, oscillating between heated arguments, attempts at emotional manipulation, promises of change, and finally explicit threats of lawsuits. Maurice answered all the legal questions with clinical precision, making it clear that the will was irrevocable, and that we had abundant evidence of their behavior after my supposed death. Sullivan revealed his true identity and mentioned the recordings and photographic documentation of everything that had occurred in the last few days. Melissa was the first to give up, dragging Christopher out after a final failed attempt at negotiation. Thomas followed shortly after, practically carrying Carolyn, who alternated between crying fits and increasingly incoherent threats. Before they left, I informed them that they could visit their grandchildren at my house at the times we agreed upon, but that none of them were welcome in my life without an explicit invitation. When they finally left, the house fell into a heavy silence, broken only by Charlotte's suppressed crying. The twins sat side by side on the couch, their heads bowed. I sat between them, cradling Charlotte on my lap. "You're not to blame for anything," he said softly. "And I don't want you to think for a second that this changes how much I love you. You are the best part of my life, always have been and always will be." I spent the next few hours trying to explain what had happened in a simple, age-appropriate way. That sometimes adults make serious mistakes, that money can make people act in ways they shouldn't, and that despite everything, their parents loved them, even if they'd made bad choices. In the end, Morris arranged for the three of them to stay with me for a few days until the situation calmed down. Martha came to keep us company and help with the children. Sullivan assured them the house was safe by installing an updated security system before saying goodbye. The following weeks were a period of adjustment and rebuilding. Christopher and Carolyn made several attempts to contact each other, alternating between apologies, justifications, and veiled threats. Through Morris, I set clear conditions for any reconciliation: mandatory family therapy, full return of all items, removed from the house public acknowledgement of the truth about what they had done, and a 6-month probationary period where our contact would be strictly supervised and limited to visits with the grandchildren. Caroline eventually accepted the terms, more out of financial desperation than genuine remorse. Christopher resisted for longer, but when Melissa left him taking half of the couple's assets and threatening to publicly expose the whole story, he too relented. Emotional recovery was much slower than practical problem solving. I spent several weeks in intensive therapy, processing the pain of betrayal, mourning a family I had envisioned, and the guilt of exposing my grandchildren to unnecessary trauma. Martha remained by my side as a loyal friend, often spending nights at my house when nightmares and anxiety attacks made it impossible to be alone. Maurice visited regularly, not only as my advocate, but as someone who had witnessed everything and didn't judge me for the extreme decisions I made. Even Sullivan, after his official work ended, stayed in touch, occasionally bringing homemade treats made by his wife and funny stories to distract me. The first family therapy sessions were disastrous. Christopher could barely look at me responding to the therapist's questions with hostile monosyllables. Caroline cried constantly, positioning herself as the victim of the situation. Thomas remained calculatingly neutral, clearly present, only because he had to. Melissa, who surprisingly chose to participate even after separating from Christopher, was the only one to show any real progress, admitting her greed and expressing regret that seemed genuine. The grandchildren, especially the twins, showed signs of trauma, alternating between anger, confusion, and a worrying silence. Charlotte, younger and more resilient, adapted better, happy to have her grandmother back, but unable to fully grasp the complexity of the situation. 6 months passed. It was July 2023, and the world had changed considerably around me. Christopher and Melissa had reconciled not out of love, but out of financial necessity, and were trying to rebuild their store with a legitimate bank loan. Carolyn had finally admitted that many of her financial crises were fabricated or exaggerated to extract money from me. Thomas had lost his job due to questionable practices and was working as a bartender while taking online courses to change careers. My grandchildren were slowly adapting to their new reality, helped by experienced child therapists and the stable routine I was striving to maintain. As for me, I had rediscovered small pleasures, playing the piano again, gardening on Sunday mornings, reading groups at the local library, and even a timid return to volunteering at the hospital where I had worked for so many years. The pain of betrayal was still there, a constant presence in the back of my mind, but I had learned to live with it, to recognize it as part of my history, not as defining my future. In August, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I amended my will again. Not to benefit Christopher and Carolyn, but to create a foundation in the name of my late husband, Richard. The Taylor Foundation would support nurses caring for elderly parents, offering financial and emotional support to prevent other families from going through what mine had. I invited my children to serve on the foundation's board, not as beneficiaries, but as active contributors to something bigger than ourselves. Caroline accepted immediately, seeing an opportunity for redemption. Christopher hesitated, wary of anything involving money and family, but eventually agreed after a long conversation with his children, who encouraged him to try. The foundation's first project was a small weekend retreat for nurses and their elderly parents held in September at a cozy hotel outside Boston. We worked together for the first time in years. I handled scheduling. Carolyn handled logistics. Christopher handled finances, and even Thomas and Melissa contributed their respective skills. It wasn't perfect. There were tense moments, misinterpreted comments, and old hurts resurfacing at unexpected moments. But there was something new to a genuine effort, a tentative desire to build. Something positive from the ashes of what we had destroyed. At the end of the retreat, when a 32-year-old nurse hugged me with tears in her eyes, thanking me for the opportunity to spend quality time with her 7-8-year-old mother, I looked at my children and saw something I hadn't expected to see again: pride. Not in money, not in material possessions, but in having been part of something meaningful. In October, I invited the family over for dinner. It wasn't a special occasion, just a regular Sunday. I cooked everyone's favorites, including the chocolate raspberry cake my grandchildren loved so much. Unlike my birthday, the year before, everyone attended. Conversation was cautious at first, polite and superficial. But as the evening wore on, something subtly shifted. Charlotte excitedly recounted her first day of school. Kevin and Kyle detailed their adventures at summer camp. Caroline mentioned a design course she was taking online. Christopher talked about an interesting patient who had come to the clinic. Melissa showed photos of an antique piece of furniture she had restored. Thomas commented on a book he was reading about personal finance. They were simple, everyday conversations, the kind of things normal families discuss at Sunday dinner. Nothing extraordinary. And yet for us, it was revolutionary. For a few moments between one bite and the next, between a laugh and a banal comment, we were just a family. Imperfect, damaged healing, but a family. When everyone had left, I was left alone in the living room, staring at the messy table, the dirty plates, the half-empty glasses. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, nor a fairy tale happy ending. There was still a long road ahead, years of therapy, relapses, difficult moments. Trust once so completely broken might never be fully restored. But there was a beginning there, a small green shoot emerging from what we thought was barren soil. I had learned a painful lesson that love, even between parents and children, is neither unconditional nor guaranteed. That it needs to be cultivated, tested at times, and always protected from the cold winds of greed and selfishness. But I also learned that some plants are surprisingly resilient, capable of blooming again even after the harshest winter. Today, almost a year after my death and resurrection, I look back on the journey with a mixture of pain and hope. I don't know what the future holds for our fractured and mended family. I don't know if my children have truly changed or if they've simply learned to better hide their true selves. I don't know if the traumas we inflicted on my grandchildren will leave permanent scars. But I know I'm alive, not just in the biological sense, but truly alive for the first time in a long time. Free from the shackles of unfulfilled expectations, free from the illusion of a perfect family, free to rebuild relationships based on truth, however painful it may be. Sometimes in the stillness of the night, when everyone is asleep and the house is silent, I sit at the piano and play the melodies Richard loved so much. The notes flow through the empty rooms, echoing against the walls that have witnessed so much love and so much pain. It's in these moments that I feel he's still with me, somehow guiding my decisions, applauding my courage, reminding me that life is too short to be lived inauthentically. In December, as the first anniversary of Richard's death approached, I made another significant decision. I sold the house in Newton, not to give the money to my children, but to buy a larger property on the outskirts of town. A house with enough space for a small community center on the ground floor dedicated to senior programs, and a comfortable apartment upstairs where I could live independently. The Taylor Foundation now had a physical headquarters, a place where retired nurses could gather to share experiences, where exhausted caregivers could find a few hours of respite, where families could learn to navigate the complexities of aging with dignity. Christopher and Carolyn reacted with surprise to the change, but not with hostility. On the contrary, they offered to help with the move, with organizing the space, with publicizing the programs. It was a cautious approach, still testing the limits of the new dynamic, but genuine in its own way. The grandchildren were excited about having a larger space to play, especially the spacious garden with trees, perfect for climbing, and a shallow stream where they could search for frogs on summer afternoons. Christmas 2023 was celebrated in the new house, with the whole family together. It wasn't perfect. There were still tense moments, glances that lingered a second longer than they should have, silences that stretched uncomfortably. But there were also gifts chosen with genuine care, not just for their monetary value. Christopher gave me an album of old photographs he'd digitized and restored. Carolyn brought a cutting from a rare plant she knew I admired. Thomas and Melissa contributed their own skills to the party he prepared. Sophisticated cocktails he'd learned as a bartender. She decorated the house with elegant arrangements that demonstrated her true aesthetic flair. January 2024 marked the first anniversary of my death. As a family, we decided to turn that date into something positive. Instead of remembering the betrayal, the pain, and the bitter revelations, we organized a benefit for the Taylor Foundation. An evening of live music with my modest participation on piano, an auction of artwork donated by local artists, and moving testimonials from nurses and caregivers who had benefited from our programs was an unqualified success, raising far more than expected and firmly establishing the foundation in Boston's philanthropic community. I saw my children that night in a different light. Christopher, always efficient, coordinating logistics with precision. Caroline, socially adept, circulating among the guests, ensuring everyone felt welcome. They weren't perfect, they never would be. The greed was still there, a character trait that might never completely disappear. But they were striving to be better, not just to regain my financial favor, but because they had glimpsed, perhaps for the first time, the emptiness at the heart of lives devoted exclusively to material accumulation. February brought an unexpected surprise. Melissa, who had reconciled with Christopher but maintained a previously unheard of independence, announced she was pregnant. At 42, it wasn't a planned pregnancy, nor was it easily achieved. The twins, now teenagers, were torn between embarrassment and curiosity about their new brother or sister. Christopher seemed simultaneously terrified and proud. For me, it was an opportunity for generational redemption, a chance to see a new life grow in a healthier family environment, more aware of the dangers of greed and the spiritual emptiness it brings. March was a month of personal reflection. I turned 69 in age. Richard never had the chance to reach. I held a small celebration at the foundation with the residents, volunteers, and of course, my family. It was during this simple celebration, watching my children interact with the elderly, helping serve cake patiently, listening to stories they had surely heard before, that I realized something important. They were learning to give, not just receive. It was a slow process, sometimes painful for egos accustomed to considering only their own needs, but it was happening before my eyes. April brought abundant rains and the blossoming of the community garden we had started on the foundation's land. It was a project especially dear to my heart, a space where elderly residents could work side by side with local children, including my grandchildren, imparting knowledge not found in books or the internet. Charlotte proved particularly gifted with plants, absorbing lessons from a 2-year-old former farmer on when to plant, how to care for them, and how to harvest at the right time. Watching them together, the 8-year-old girl and the man who had lived nearly a century, was to witness the true transmission of values across generations, something sorely missing in my own family. May was a month of expansion for the foundation. We received a substantial donation from a former patient of Richard's, allowing us to expand our programs to include legal assistance for seniors at risk of financial exploitation. Maurice, who had become not only my lawyer but also a close friend and advisor, offered to lead this initiative. Christopher surprised everyone by suggesting an additional program: free medical consultations for caregivers who often neglected their own health in favor of those they cared for. It was a genuinely altruistic idea, perhaps born of a belated understanding of the sacrifice that caring for someone truly entails, a lesson Richard and I had tried to teach by example, but which only now seemed to be truly sinking in. June brought Charlotte's birthday, a celebration that stretched across an entire weekend. Unlike previous birthdays where competition for the most expensive gift was practically declared, this one was notable for its simplicity and focus on shared experience. Caroline had planned a series of activities her daughter would truly appreciate: a morning at the botanical garden, an afternoon of painting with a local artist, a picnic in the park with school friends. The gifts were mostly handmade or carefully chosen for their meaning, not their price. Christopher and Melissa gave their niece a telescope they had found at a thrift store and restored together, fueling Charlotte's budding interest in astronomy. Thomas surprisingly wrote and illustrated a short storybook starring a fictionalized version of Charlotte as a courageous explorer. Watching all this sitting comfortably on the porch while the children ran around the garden and the adults chatted in small groups, I felt something that had eluded me for a long time: peace. Not the perfect peace of solved problems and completely healed wounds, those might never come, but the imperfect, real peace that comes from acceptance from the difficult but necessary, forgiveness from the understanding that people can change, not completely, not instantly, but gradually, in small, almost imperceptible increments that added up over time can transform a character. July 2024 marked a year and a half since the death that changed everything. The Taylor Foundation was now an established and respected presence in the community. My children, though still struggling with their materialistic tendencies, were visibly different from the people who had planned to divide my assets while I supposedly lay dead. Melissa's pregnancy was progressing well, with the baby, a girl we discovered, due in September. My grandchildren were flourishing, having processed the trauma of those strange days with the help of therapy and the constant support of adults who slowly but surely were learning to put love above greed. And me, I had found a new purpose in life, not just as a mother or grandmother, but as a force for change in the community. The Taylor Foundation had helped dozens of families navigate the turbulent waters of aging, caregiving, dependence, and independence. It had facilitated difficult conversations about money, inheritance, expectations, love, the same conversations my own family had avoided for so long with devastating consequences. Each family helped was a small victory, a validation of the extreme decision I had made that cold January. Today, as I sit in my office at the foundation, looking out the window at the garden where Charlotte is teaching a group of local children how to plant tomatoes, I reflect on the extraordinary journey of the past few years. The pain of betrayal has never completely faded. There are moments, usually in the quiet hours of the night, when I relive those cruel words beside my life supposed coffin, and the wound feels as fresh as it did the first day. But these moments are becoming less frequent, less intense, like a tide slowly receding, leaving behind only marks in the sand that will eventually wash away. What remains, what grows stronger every day, is the understanding that death was in many ways a rebirth. For me, who finally had the courage to face painful truths and establish healthy boundaries. For my children, who were forced to confront the worst of themselves and slowly, painfully begin the work of rebuilding. For my grandchildren, who witnessed both the worst and the best of the adults in their lives and will hopefully learn the right lessons from it all. The new babies soon to arrive into this complicated world will be born into an imperfect but conscious family, damaged but healing. She won't know the previous versions of her parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, those people consumed by greed, capable of celebrating the death of a loved one if it meant material gain. She will know only the current versions, still flawed, still struggling with old habits and tendencies, but committed to something greater than themselves. This is perhaps the greatest victory of all, that the next generation has the chance to grow up different, better. If you've made it this far in my story, you may have identified with some part of it. Maybe you're a parent who feels like your children only approach you when they need something. Maybe you're a son or daughter who notices toxic patterns in their own behavior toward their parents. Or maybe you're simply fascinated by the intricate and often painful ballet we call family, regardless of your situation. I hope my extreme experience serves as a reminder that sometimes we need drastic shocks to see the truth that money has a frightening power to reveal character, and that it's never too late to rebuild from the rubble, even if the new building never looks exactly like the old. If this story touched you in any way, please leave a like so it can reach more people who might need to hear it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced a similar situation? How did you deal with it? And subscribe to the channel for more real stories like this, where we explore the complexities, pain, and beauty of family relationships in all their imperfections. Because in the end, it's our shared stories that connect us, that remind us that we are not alone in our struggles, and that even in the darkest moments, there is always the possibility of light.